This is an RNZ podcast.
Kia ora, ko William Ray tēnei. Welcome to Black Sheep and the second in a two-part episode on Nurse Elspeth Kerr. In our last episode, we looked at Elspeth Kerr's early life, how she and her husband emigrated to New Zealand from Scotland in the wake of the First World War, and how Elspeth became a beloved local nurse in Devonport on Auckland's North Shore. We told you about the sudden death of Elspeth's husband, Charles. We also told you how, shortly after Charles's death, the Kerr's foster daughter, Betty, fell into a coma 3 separate times in the space of a few weeks, twice at home in Devonport and once in Auckland Hospital. After that final incident, her doctors had reached a shocking conclusion. 9-year-old Betty Kerr was being deliberately poisoned. After sealing off Betty's room, her doctors contacted the Auckland police. Detectives began their investigation immediately, but they had to wait several weeks before they got the results of Betty's urine tests. When those results came back, they showed this little girl had somehow ingested a massive dose of a sleeping drug called Veronal. Here's Scott Bainbridge, author of The Trials of Nurse Kerr.
Okay, so Veronal, it doesn't exist today, but it was created by some German physicists back in 1902 to help people that that suffered from insomnia and they couldn't sleep. It also did a little bit for depression.
These days, barbiturate drugs like Veronal are highly controlled because they're both highly addictive and carry a serious risk of overdose. But in the 1930s, Veronal was assumed to be relatively safe. You could buy it over the counter at a pharmacy.
But, it was a drug, and of course, like with all drugs, it was misused. The people in the jazz set all misused it. Robin Hyde, our, famous poet, was addicted to it. Catherine Mansfield had taken it. So it was, very popular as an illicit drug.
And even in the 1930s, people were starting to raise the alarm about the risk of Veronal overdose.
Like the Queen of Romania overdosed on it, but she did survive. There was a doctor in Dargaville who he made front page news for dying of an overdose, but he'd been taking Veronal by the packet load every day. He was, severely addicted to it.
And Betty had been sent home with some Veronal, right, or an associated drug with sort of instructions that it could be used to help her sleep if she was still feeling unwell. So, it wasn't surprising there'd be some of the stuff in her system, but not this much.
Not that much. And there were derivations of Veronal. There was Medinol, a tablet which had traces of Veronal in it. And there's also Veramon, which was, again, it was not a very strong type of Veronal. One of the doctors who visited Betty did give her a Veramon tablet and said that if Betty gets ill overnight, for the nurse to give her the tablet. But there was more. Once they did the tests on her urine sample, there was more than just one Veramon tablet in her system. There was definitely a lot of Veronal.
Ordinarily, you'd assume a child overdosing on a pharmaceutical drug would be an accident. But 3 times? That started to look more suspicious. Detectives arrived from Auckland City to interview Nurse Kerr. Here's how that conversation was recorded.
We are certain that Betty had taken some drugs. This has been proved by the government analyst. She must have obtained these drugs by accident or design, and I need you to tell the truth. Is it at all possible that Betty had obtained the drugs herself, here, in this house?
Not at all. What drugs I use are from my patients. I've always kept all the drugs in the medicine chest, in the kitchenette. As you can see, the chest is high up and Betty cannot ever reach it that easily. Betty has never attempted to obtain any kind of drugs or medicines, even out of curiosity.
Detectives searched the chest and the rest of the house. They didn't find any Veronal. So they sat Elspeth Kerr down again and laid out the facts. Betty had fallen into a coma 3 separate times, and her urine showed she had ingested a large amount of Veronal, much more than a therapeutic dose, even for an adult.
I cannot account for it. They make mistakes in the hospitals.
I conducted a search of the medicine chest at Ward 20 with Sister Pottinger, and there were no drugs of any Veronal type there.
I cannot account for it.
Everything points to you having given the child drugs, specifically Veronal. If you did give her Veronal to ease her pain or to help her sleep, you must tell me.
I cannot account for it.
The detectives, just like the doctors before them, were stumped. Circumstances pointed towards Betty's foster mother as the source of the Veronal. But to many, it seemed impossible that she would have deliberately poisoned this little girl. Everyone who knew Elspeth Kerr seemed to regard her as a saint. They said she was totally devoted to Betty, just like she was her own blood. But that picture started to change after detectives interviewed a young nurse in training, Muriel Rosenfeld. Muriel had worked at Elspeth Kerr's nursing home for a few weeks to provide some relief when Nurse Kerr was unwell.
She recalled that Nurse Kerr had actually collapsed and was bedridden for a week, and she went in and recalled seeing Nurse Kerr in bed, and when she fluffed up the pillows, a tube of Medinol fell out onto the floor.
Medinol was essentially just a slightly less potent form of Veronal, the same drug, just mixed differently. Muriel, this young nurse in training, asked Elspeth Kerr about the empty paper tube a few days later.
When it was raised with her, Nurse Kerr did actually say, "Hey, look, I'm having trouble sleeping, so I'm taking Medinol." But it seemed that she was taking an awful lot of Medinol. And this was about a year before, so the police started to think that, well, actually, is she addicted to Medinol? Had she overcome an addiction to Medinol and she'd upped it to Veronal? And so that was their line of thinking at that time.
Detectives spoke to a family friend who remembered Elspeth Kerr saying she used Medinol and Veronal regularly to help her sleep and calm her nerves. Other friends described Nurse Kerr as looking increasingly dishevelled and tired in recent months. At the time, they'd put that down to the strain of looking after Betty and Charles and running a nursing home. But police started to suspect she was really suffering the effects of a long-term addiction. This may have been the real cause of her collapse and hospitalisation in the days before Charles died. But even with this new piece of the puzzle, police were no closer to solving the mystery of Betty Kerr's poisoning. It seemed possible that the first 2 poisonings were an accident. Maybe Betty had seen her foster mother taking these tablets and decided to give them a try herself. But that 3rd poisoning was different. That time, Betty had got sick inside the hospital, just after her foster mother had been seen passing her a lolly. That suggested something far more sinister. By this point, the case had reached the desk of Inspector James Cummings, a very senior detective with a hard-won reputation for solving difficult cases. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes novels, literally once described him as, and I quote, the real Sherlock Holmes. The first thing Cummings did was to widen the scope of the investigation. After all, there had been another sudden, unexplained illness in the Kerr household in recent times.
Inspector Cummings, when he learnt that Charles Kerr had died a month or 2 before Betty fell ill, he then decided that it just seems a little bit odd that this guy who, yes, he's mentally unwell, but physically, there weren't too many issues with his health. Could he have taken Veronal? Now, Veronal can stay in a person's system for almost 100 years. And so the Minister of Health wasn't too happy, but he signed off on the exhumation. And so, one morning they did go out and they exhumed Charles Kerr.
The pathologist took samples of fluid from the coffin and also examined Charles Kerr's brain. Those examinations showed two things. First, there was absolutely no sign that Charles Kerr had suffered a brain hemorrhage, his official cause of death. Second, the fluid in the coffin contained extremely high levels of veronal. Now, there were two people close to Nurse Kerr who'd ended up taking massive doses of this potentially deadly drug. And where there were two, there might be more.
Nurse Kerr primarily cared for elderly people at the end of their lives. So, it would have been quite easy for her to have administered veronal to ease their pain, or given slightly too much in order to help them sleep better, and they died. Nurse Kerr wasn't a terribly meticulous record keeper, so the police had to rely on the recollections of those nurse aides to remember particular names of patients. And one of the nurses recalled that in July of 1931, there was an elderly patient called Emma Day who had had a number of strokes, and she was been staying with Nurse Kerr for a number of months. And on a particular day, she didn't wake up. And the nurse explained that was a surprise because, yes, Mrs. Day, had had a number of strokes and she was reasonably bedridden, but, her mind was pretty active. And, it came as a surprise that she had passed. Similarly to Charles Kerr, Dr. Wheeler was very quick around the day that Emma Day died, and again closed off or wrote off her death as being one of cerebral hemorrhage, and she was buried shortly afterwards. So the police contacted Mrs. Day's husband, who lived he was an auctioneer in Hamilton, and explained the situation to him, and he gave his blessing, I guess, to exhume her body.
Just like Charles Kerr, the results of the tests of Emma Day showed no sign of a brain hemorrhage and very high levels of veronal. Inspector Cummings had seen enough. Elspeth Kerr was arrested.
However, she's only arrested and charged with administering poison to hurt Betty, even though Charles Kerr and Emma Day had traces of veronal in their systems and their deaths had been written off as something completely different. There was no proof that Nurse Kerr had anything to do with their deaths.
The thing is, it was all circumstantial. Nobody had actually seen Elspeth Kerr dropping green liquid from a bottle with a skull and crossbones on it into anyone's morning tea. And then there was the question of motive. The idea Elspeth might have murdered Charles made a certain amount of sense. His declining mental state made him a difficult person to live with, and what's more, Elspeth had actually taken out 2 life insurance policies in his name, so potentially 2 pretty good reasons for her to want him dead. Emma Day was more problematic. Inspector Cummings wondered if the nurse had been pushing elderly patients like Emma to change their wills to name her as a beneficiary, and then quietly poison them to collect the cash. But there was no evidence in Elspeth Kerr's financial records of her receiving anything other than the usual payment for her services.
I know that the police had a massive debate with the Crown Prosecutor, Sir Vincent Meredith. The police certainly wanted to charge Nurse Kerr with those other 2 deaths, but Sir Vincent Meredith was, a very clever lawyer, and he knew that if they did charge her with those deaths, it would be a massively uphill battle.
Because no one had seen her give them anything, the Veronal could have come from anywhere, right?
That's right. I mean, they even thought that Charles Kerr, he may have taken the Veronal himself. If there was Veronal in the house, he would have known where it was stored. And, he was in the house all day, and he could have quite easily have taken it.
So, ultimately, the only charge against Elspeth Kerr was administering poison with intent to harm her foster daughter, Dorothy Cameron, aka Betty Kerr. The facts of that case were stronger. Betty had seemingly been poisoned 3 separate times, which made a mistake or an accident on Elspeth's part difficult to believe. But there were still people prepared to fight in Nurse Kerr's corner.
Obviously, this made front page news. This well-respected nurse, she's up on these charges, and, a lot of people in Auckland either knew her or knew of her and knew her reputation. So, she had the support of the fledgling women's movement.
One of Elspeth Kerr's chief backers was a women's rights campaigner called Miriam Soljak.
Whenever there was a perceived wrong of a woman in the community, Miriam would go all out in support. Nurse Kerr, she was only going to rely on the duty solicitor, but Miriam convinced Richard Singer to take her case on. And Richard Singer was the scourge for all the judges and criminal prosecutors, because he was an actor, he was an orator, like Charles Dello over in America, who took 24 hours to sum up, the Leopold and Loeb case. Richard Singer was very much of that same ilk.
But while Miriam Soljak arranged for Singer to represent Kerr early on in the investigation, by the time the trial actually got started, she had changed her mind about the nurse.
As the investigation wore on, and these bodies were being exhumed and traces of Veronal were being found, then Miriam's stance on it changed reasonably fast. Because it was a controversial time for the women's movement at that time, she probably quite wisely decided to step aside.
Richard Singer, meanwhile, was still ready to go guns blazing in defence of his client.
He debated absolutely everything that Sir Vincent Meredith raised during the trial.
And he does identify some actual problems, right? Like, for example, the chain of custody for the samples of Betty's urine from which the Veronal is found is not good.
Oh, look, what he uncovered there in his own investigation of Auckland hospital processes beggared belief. This particular bottle of urine, the crucial bottle, had been missing for a month. The sample bottle was due to be collected in the early hours of a particular morning, and it wasn't, and it was handed to somebody else who took it to one of the hospital custodians who wasn't in his office, so they passed it down a slide chute in the guy's door, and then somebody came and collected it, and then, biked off to the analyst, and by that stage, it'd gone almost a month. And so Richard Singer, he said, well, firstly, how do you know that it's the right sample bottle? It had passed through so many hands, and if so, could it still be viably analysed? Was it too old?
And when he wasn't throwing doubt on key evidence in the case, Singer was trading balms with Sir Vincent Meredith, and even with the judge. Things got very heated. At one point, the judge threatened to fine Singer in contempt, and Singer essentially said, "Bring it on." And it was all great entertainment, but it made life hard for the jury.
The first jury, they heard the trial and they couldn't reach a decision, so it went to second trial, and the same thing happened.
In the third trial, the jury came back early on in their deliberations to say they didn't think they could come to a unanimous decision either.
The judge, poor old judge, put his head in his hands and basically begged the jury to go away and reconsider, because he just couldn't bear, another trial where he had to put up with Richard Singer's antics.
The jury reconvened and got back to work. And to be fair, there was a lot to work through. The medical evidence was complicated, and even the experts had a hard time keeping it straight.
There was no veronal expert in New Zealand, and so the police relied on the government analyst whose knowledge of veronal was just, from reading a textbook. He was unfortunately thrust into the role of being the expert veronal specialist in New Zealand when he wasn't. And it was also unfortunate that Richard Singer, his own brother, was a world-renowned physician with an expertise on drugs. So he was able to get all of the updated journals and to run rings around the prosecution.
But maybe the strangest thing in the third trial was the testimony of Dr. Wheeler. Remember, this was the elderly retired Navy surgeon who worked with Nurse Kerr from time to time. It was Dr. Wheeler who'd signed off on the deaths of Charles Kerr and Mrs. Day as brain hemorrhages, and who'd initially diagnosed Betty with appendicitis.
Because he was wrong with Betty's appendicitis diagnosis, he was called into questioning and he was given a hard time. And, he felt he was 86, so his own reputation was in tatters.
The 86-year-old Dr. Wheeler weathered a bombardment of questions from Sir Vincent Meredith. But then when he finished his testimony, he did something absolutely extraordinary.
When he walked off the stand, he turned to Nurse Kerr and blew her a kiss. And that just, the entire courtroom went quiet.
So, what the hell was going on here? Well, if we're sticking to the facts, we've got to say we just don't know. To me, it does seem kind of unlikely that Dr. Wheeler had any direct role in the various poisonings, but maybe he was a bit infatuated with this likeable, much younger nurse and he wanted to be helpful. So when she wanted a particular diagnosis, he was happy to oblige. What the jury made of it? Well, we don't quite know. After going back and doing a bit more deliberation, they sent word they had managed to reach a verdict. A reporter from the New Zealand Truth was in the room to record the moment.
As the accused woman walked to the front of the carved wooden dock, calm and unperturbed as ever, silence, tense and dramatic, laid its grip upon the solemn stage on which the throbbing climax of a great human drama was to be enacted.
How find ye?
We find the accused guilty on all counts.
All eyes turned to Elspeth Kerr.
She stood unmoved. Her face retained its expression of determination. Even her lips did not quiver. The only signs that her outward nerve had at last been shaken were her red-rimmed eyes, indicative of a night spent in tears. But as she faced his honour, her lips were set, not a tremor was observed as sentence was pronounced.
That sentence was 6 years with hard labour. Now, full credit to the New Zealand Truth for its dramatic reporting, especially the throbbing climax of a great human drama. That's a it's a line. I expect no less from our most famous tabloid, but I've got to say this is a somewhat unsatisfying end to the story of Nurse Kerr, because we never get the answer to the question which must have been burning inside a lot of people. Presuming she did do it, why did she do it? And that unanswered question was actually pointed out pretty directly by Sir Vincent Meredith in his opening address at the first trial.
In this case, there is ascertainably no motive sufficiently strong to impel a person of ordinary, normal mentality to commit the fiendish crime of poisoning.
The explanation Sir Vincent gave was that Elspeth Kerr was not a person of ordinary, normal mentality. She was a drug addict. He also made some slightly vague comments that drug addicts could be, quote, morally disturbed. From a 21st century perspective, that seems like pretty old-fashioned thinking, and Veronal is not a class of drug which is usually associated with violence, like, say, methamphetamine or alcohol for that matter.
Even early on in the investigation, the police struggled with coming up with a motive because it just didn't make sense at all.
One of the ideas that's been brought up in the years since, and this theory wasn't around back then, is, I don't think they call it this anymore, you're saying, but Munchausen by proxy.
Munchausen's by proxy is a condition that the parent would deliberately make the child ill and keep them in a state of sickness so they could get the attention heaped on themselves. Like, say if you've got a little boy and you constantly make him sick, and then you take him to the doctor and the doctors will make a fuss and the nurses make a fuss. And it's definitely like an attention-seeking disorder. It's not called Munchausen's now. It's now like a factitious disorder. Maybe Nurse Kerr had a fictitious disorder. However, I consulted Dr. Susan Hattis-Friedman, who would be the world-renowned expert on factitious disorders. She works at hospital in Cleveland, and she gave evidence at the trial in Timaru, the mum who allegedly killed the 3 children.
The Lauren Dickerson case, yeah.
And we had a good chat. I gave her all the notes that I had on Nurse Kerr, and it was quite interesting to talk to her, because she said that the difference with this case is that Nurse Kerr didn't seek the limelight. So she didn't do this for attention. In fact, all her actions seem to be that she didn't want to be involved. She's reluctant to send Betty to the hospital. She doesn't make Betty sick for the attention. So therefore, a factitious disorder can be ruled out.
So what does that leave as an explanation? I guess we'll never know, but what's your suspicion?
Only really leaves one result, and that's that she's, a cold-hearted killer.
Like a serial killer?
Yeah. Could she have given Charles Veronal, could she have given Mrs. Day Veronal, to ease their pain and their discomfort, and they died? You'd think that if that was the case, she would have learned not to do that. She would have maybe done it once, and that you don't do it again, because, if you give too much Veronal, you're going to kill them. If that's the case, she hasn't learned her lesson. She's poisoned 3 people, and I tend to think that, she's deliberately done it.
This is another theory which wasn't available to police and prosecutors in Elspeth Kerr's time. The idea of serial or sequence killers was invented by FBI criminologists in the 1970s, years after Kerr herself had passed away. A serial killer is typically defined as someone who's compelled to kill out of some deep-seated psychological disorder. Typically, they also have to have murdered at least 3 people to meet the definition. No modern criminologist or psychotherapist ever got the chance to examine Elspeth Kerr, so we'll never know whether she met the first part of that criteria. And strictly speaking, she didn't meet the second part either, presuming she only murdered Charles Kerr and Emma Day. But police always suspected there might have been more victims. And so does Scott Bainbridge. First, there's that skeleton which Simon Gundry and his crew found digging on the grounds of Kerr's old nursing home.
It was determined that the skeleton had been buried there underground for about 70 years. So that would take you back to 1920s, which is when Nurse Kerr had her nursing home in Cheltenham Beach. They couldn't determine the identity of the body, only that it was a female, aged sort of roughly about 60 to 80.
There was nothing else the police could find from these bones. Tests showed no traces of Veronal. It's possible the skeleton had no link to Nurse Kerr whatsoever. But the discovery of those bones did unearth some long-buried memories. Betty Kerr, or Dorothy Cameron to give her actual name, was still alive when that skeleton was discovered. After her brush with death as a 9-year-old, she'd been returned to the care of her birth mother in Morrinsville. In 1992, aged in her late 60s, Dorothy got in touch with the police. although the officer in charge, Detective Pat Hancock, was quoted as saying she couldn't give much information. The bigger development came from another family who had memories dredged up by the discovery of the skeleton. A family who'd kept their silence for more than 60 years.
A lady came forward who I've since been in touch with. She recalled that her aunt, who was aged about 11, I think, back in the 1920s, Vera was her name, Vera Mason. She hung out in Devonport with Betty Kerr and a lot of the other kids. Back then it was a safe community and the kids would all run around. Well, Vera's mum was giving birth at the hospital, and so her dad asked Nurse Kerr if, she would just keep an eye out on Vera and her brother, while he went to visit his wife in hospital. There was nothing wrong with Vera. She was a reasonably healthy girl, and within a day she fell ill and, she died, very, very quickly. One of the last things that Vera had said was that Nurse Kerr had given her a butterscotch sweet, and it wasn't long after that she was feeling sick. I obtained the death certificate, but the cause of death essentially was not known. And so I made contact with Vera's niece. The family are adamant that, Nurse Kerr did have a hand in Vera's death.
Conceivably, it could still be possible to exhume Vera Mason's remains and test them for veronal. Traces of the drug could still be there, even though 100 years have passed.
But, that's never going to happen because Nurse Kerr herself died in 1968 or 1969. So, if that was the case, who would you charge?
As for the end of Elspeth Kerr's story, well, she was released from prison in 1938 and faded into obscurity.
At that stage, when she was released, her son was living in Papakura, and she went down to join him. She changed her name, and she found work as a nurse aide, I think in Kingseat Hospital, for a number of years. So she was never allowed to practice nursing, but she went back to, I guess, in that medical field.
There's no chance that she kept on killing, is there? Because, I know Kingseat, like a lot of those psychiatric facilities, a lot of people did die inside them.
It's a possibility that I never looked at, but, quite possibly. Unless every single case is looked at, it's like a needle in a haystack.
Black Sheep is written and produced by me, William Ray. The sound engineer for this episode was William Saunders. Our production coordinator is Brianna Juritich-Gregg. And our executive producer is Tim Watkin, who tells me he is proud to have been compared to Genghis Khan, a man estimated to have caused the deaths of between 20 and 60 million people. Read into that what you wish. Our voice actors for these past two episodes were Duncan Smith, Justin Gregory, Colin Peacock, and in the role she was born to play, Murderous Nurse, we had Susie Ferguson, taking a break from her day job as co-host of the Saturday morning show on RNZ National. Susie and I actually had a bit of a chat about Black Sheep over on her show, and if you want to hear that, you can check it out on the Saturday morning podcast feed, because just in case you didn't know, all of RNZ's radio programs can be followed for free on your favourite podcasting app. Until next time, mā te wā.